A millionaire husband handed his 9 months pregnant wife divorce papers right at her mother's funeral as the casket was being lowered into the ground. No warning, no mercy, just betrayal delivered in broad daylight. And while she stood there shaking, holding her belly and her heartbreak, he walked away with another woman smirking. But what he didn't know was that this moment would become the beginning of his downfall. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Let's get started. The earth was still fresh when the casket holding Margaret Gates began its slow descent into the ground. Abigail Gomez stood beside it, one hand pressed against her 9-month belly, fighting a tightening cramp that rolled through her like a warning. She tried to breathe steadily, tried to be present for the last moment she would ever share with her mother, but grief sat heavy on her chest, squeezing her lungs. The world around her felt muted, soft murmurs, rustling leaves, the priest's fading prayer. Nothing existed except the loss in front of her and the child inside her who still depended on her strength. She didn't hear Aaron DiCaprio approach until she caught the crunch of his shoes against the gravel behind her, a sharp, cutting sound that didn't belong in a place meant for mourning. She turned, expecting the comfort of her husband's arms, some small tenderness on a day already unbearable. Instead, she met a face carved in stone, cold and indifferent. His eyes held none of the warmth that once promised forever. Something in her stomach twisted not the baby, but her intuition. Without a word, Aaron pulled a manila folder from his jacket and shoved it toward her chest. "Sign it. I want this done today." Abigail blinked, unsure she'd heard him correctly. What is this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile and trembling. "Divorce," he said. "I'm done pretending. Sign it so we can move on." The shift in the air was immediate. A few guests turned to look. Someone gasped under their breath. Abigail felt her knees weaken as she stared at the papers, unable to comprehend how a man she once trusted could choose this moment, this place to break whatever remained between them. "You're choosing this? Here?" she whispered, her throat burning. "At my mother's funeral?" Aaron didn't flinch. "I don't love you anymore. You're not part of the life I want. You never were. And I'm tired of being trapped." Her heart twisted painfully. Trapped, as if she were a burden, as if the child they created together wasn't kicking beneath her ribs this very moment. A soft scoff sounded behind him. Abigail lifted her eyes and saw Kioma Kardashian stepping forward, dressed in a sleek black dress that held not a hint of respect, only victory. Kioma rested a hand on her perfectly flat stomach, her expression soaked in false sympathy. The message was unmistakable: I won. Aaron didn't bother softening the blow. "Kioma is pregnant with my child. She needs me. You don't." The world spun. Abigail gripped the folder to steady herself as whispers rippled across the cemetery. "Is that his wife? He's leaving her? Here? She's due any day." Behind the crowd, Evelyn Winfrey watched with a pleased curl at the corner of her lips, while Richard Trump nodded approvingly, as though this humiliation had been rehearsed and executed exactly as planned. Abigail had never felt so alone, so exposed, so utterly disposable. "Sign it," Aaron repeated, impatience rising in his voice. "I want my freedom before your baby gets here." End quote. A deep ache tore through her chest, mingling with another contraction. Her mother's coffin touched the bottom of the grave with a hollow thud, the sound of something ending forever. Abigail swallowed her pride, her heartbreak, her disbelief. There was no room here for a fight, not with her mother being lowered into the ground. Her hand shook violently as she scribbled her name. Tears fell, staining the page. Aaron snatched the papers the moment she finished. "I'm moving in with Kioma tonight," he announced loudly, ensuring the crowd heard. Kioma linked her arm with his as they walked away, glancing back at Abigail with a smile sharp enough to cut. The murmurs faded as people dispersed, uncomfortable, unsure whether to offer condolences or avoid looking at her altogether. In minutes, the cemetery was nearly empty. Abigail remained where she stood, staring at the fresh soil swallowing her mother and the life she once knew. A cold breeze brushed her cheek. She pressed a trembling hand against the gravestone and whispered, "Mom, he left me. He left us. What am I supposed to do now? The wind carried no answer, only silence, heavy and suffocating. And in that silence, Abigail broke for the first time. The apartment felt unfamiliar when Abigail pushed the door open, as though grief had rearranged the air itself. The space that once held laughter and quiet mornings now felt hollow, stripped of warmth. She stepped inside slowly, her body heavy from exhaustion and heartbreak. There was no husband waiting, no comforting embrace, only silence echoing back at her. Losing her mother was devastating enough, but losing her marriage on the same day carved a wound she couldn't even begin to process. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. She ignored it until the vibrations became unbearable. When she finally looked, message after message flashed across the screen, Aaron's lawyer demanding signatures, deadlines, cooperation, impersonal words designed to close a chapter she never agreed to end. Another message arrived. Please respond. We need to finalize the remaining documents. She powered off the phone, but the dread stayed with her, settling deep in her chest. Moments later, another vibration, this time from email. A notification preview displayed a familiar name, Evelyn Winfrey. Abigail hesitated, then opened it. Let my son go. He deserves someone who matches his path. Do not create obstacles for him. Handle this with dignity. Another email followed from Richard Trump, curt and condescending, urging her to avoid damaging the family name. Abigail closed her eyes as despair washed over her. They'd never seen her as part of their family. Today only confirmed it. Her friends weren't kinder. Some sent faux-concerned messages dripping with curiosity. Did you know about the pregnancy? What happened between you two? Was he unhappy for a long time? Their words stabbed at her already fragile heart. No one asked if she was okay. Not one person offered help. All they wanted was gossip. A sudden contraction hit her, sharp and unexpected. She gripped the wall, trying to steady herself. Fear gripped her throat. She was close to her due date, but stress and heartbreak were pushing her body too hard. For a moment, she wondered if she might collapse right there. She forced herself to breathe. When the pain eased, she walked toward her mother's study, the only place in the world that still felt safe. The moment she entered, her chest tightened. Everything was exactly as her mother had left it. The bookshelf, the worn leather chair, the faint scent of lavender. Abigail sank into the chair, hugging her belly. She wished her mother were here. She wished she didn't have to face this alone. Her eyes drifted to the drawer of the old desk. She opened it to look for the insurance papers for the funeral. As she sorted through envelopes, something metallic glinted beneath the folders. She pulled out a small, rusty tin box. The lock was worn and stiff, but gave way with a slight push. Inside was a folded letter and a small silver key. Her heart stuttered. She unfolded the letter with trembling hands. If you are reading this, my sweet Abigail, it means I'm no longer there to hold you through your hardest days. Tears blurred her vision as she read on. There is a safe deposit box under my name. The key inside this envelope will open it. What you find there may overwhelm you, but remember, I prepared it for the day the world became too cruel for you to stand alone. A soft sob escaped her lips. People can be unkind to a woman who carries life and loss at the same time. I couldn't stop life from hurting you, but I could make sure you had the means to rise when it did. The final lines shook her the most. You are stronger than you know. Take what I've left for you and stand tall again. Abigail pressed the letter to her heart. The loneliness that had suffocated her since the funeral loosened its grip just a little. For the first time since the graveyard, she felt something stir inside her, not anger, not despair, but a spark, hope. She tightened her hold on the silver key. Tomorrow, she would go to the bank. No matter how heavy her belly felt, no matter how exhausted she was, she would go. This was her mother's final gift, her final guidance. That night, Abigail sat alone in the dark apartment, the key resting in her palm. The weight of it felt like a promise. Mom, she whispered, whatever you left for me, I'll use it to stand back up. And slowly, the darkness around her didn't seem so suffocating anymore. The next morning, Abigail moved slowly up the steps of the downtown bank, one hand resting on her lower back as her 9-month belly pulled her forward. Her clothes were simple, her face pale from a sleepless night, but there was a quiet determination in the way she walked. The teller glanced at her with concern and immediately waved over an attendant to escort her to the safe deposit vault. As she followed the corridor lined with cold metal doors, The sterile quiet of the bank felt unreal compared to the chaos her life had become. The temperature dropped slightly as they entered the vault room, a silent chamber of steel and stillness. It felt like stepping out of her unraveling world into a place untouched by heartbreak. The attendant inserted the key assigned to her mother's box, then stepped aside. Abigail's fingers trembled as she lifted her own key, the one her mother had hidden in the tin box, and fitted it into the second lock. The mechanism clicked, a soft but decisive sound that made her heart skip. She pulled the drawer out slowly, expecting a few nostalgic mementos, maybe a handwritten note or an old piece of jewelry. But what she saw robbed her of breath. Neatly stacked folders labeled with dates, property deeds, stock certificates from major tech companies that had skyrocketed over the years, investment portfolios with numbers that didn't seem real, savings books filled with deposits and transactions spanning decades, every document meticulously organized, categorized, and preserved. She flipped through them in disbelief, scanning figures that climbed into the millions, then tens of millions, until the final tally exceeded $120 million. Her knees gave out, and she sank onto the cold floor, the drawer still open above her. A wave of shock washed over her, followed by a rush of sadness so sharp it nearly broke her. Her mother had lived modestly all her life, hiding wealth that could have changed everything. Abigail touched the edges of the papers with reverence, not because of the money, but because of the love and foresight behind it. Her mother had prepared a fortress long before Abigail ever knew she needed one. Inside the box lay one more envelope. "For my daughter, when you need strength." Her mother's handwriting curled gently across the surface. Abigail swallowed and opened it. Margaret's voice seemed to speak directly into her ear as she read. Her mother explained the secrecy, the fear that Aaron's ambitious family would one day try to absorb everything Abigail had. She warned her not to let anyone control or manipulate her future, and she named one man she trusted completely, Barrett Roberts, her longtime financial attorney. He would help her claim and protect everything she was owed. Then came the line that made Abigail pause. "If your heart feels alone, seek out Ethan Rockefeller. He carries a steadiness that could shelter you. He never stopped caring for you." Well, memories she had buried resurfaced: late-night coffee in the college library, the way Ethan laughed softly when she teased him, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. Her chest tightened with a bittersweet ache. They had never gotten their chance. Life had pulled him overseas just as she drifted toward Aaron. And now, here she was. Later that afternoon, Barrett Roberts arrived at her apartment. A composed, silver-haired man with intelligent eyes. He shook her hand gently, already aware of her fragile state. Sitting across from her at the dining table, he began explaining the intricate trust Margaret had built. Everything, every cent, every property, every portfolio, belonged solely to Abigail, untouchable by anyone else. He even reviewed her prenuptial agreement, showing her how Aaron's own insistence on it had inadvertently protected her inheritance. Her mother had planned for every possibility, even this heartbreak. Abigail felt a shift inside her, something she hadn't felt since before the funeral, an emerging strength, small but undeniable. She wasn't powerless anymore. She wasn't cornered or abandoned. She had options. She had security, and she had a future that Aaron could no longer touch. Later, after Barrett left, she held her phone for a long time, staring at Ethan's name. She hesitated, hearing her mother's words echo through her heart. Finally, she typed a short message. "Ethan, I need to talk to you." She almost regretted sending it, unsure if he would even respond after so many years. But within seconds, her phone lit up with an incoming call. "Abigail?" His voice was warm, breathless with worry. "Are you okay? You sound shaken." Her tears came before she could stop them. She tried to speak, but could only manage broken pieces of the truth. Her mother was gone. Aaron had betrayed her. Everything hurt more than she could carry. There was a brief pause on the line before Ethan responded, his tone steady and resolute. "I'm coming. You don't have to face any of this alone." When she hung up, her hand was still trembling, but not from fear this time. For the first time in days, the crushing weight of loneliness lifted enough for her to breathe. She placed her palm gently over her belly and whispered to her child, "We're not alone anymore. Your grandmother made sure of that." And in that moment, a faint glow began to warm the darkest corners of her heart. The sound of tires rolling into her driveway pulled Abigail from the couch. She moved slowly, her back aching, her steps careful. When she opened the door, Ethan Rockefeller was already halfway up the walkway, rushing toward her with concern etched deeply in his features. His SUV sat behind him, sleek, understated, nothing like the ostentatious vehicles Aaron used to flaunt. Ethan's presence alone felt grounding, like a warm current pushing back the cold that had settled inside her. "You're in pain," he said immediately, noticing the way her arm braced her stomach. He didn't ask about the baby, the divorce, or the rumors. He asked about her comfort. That alone nearly unraveled her composure. "I'm fine," she tried to say, but her voice wavered. Ethan stepped closer, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. For a moment, they stood still, the years between them folding into nothing. She saw the boy she once knew, the one who saved his last cup of coffee for her during exam nights, who walked her to class just to stretch their conversations a little longer, who never tried to own her heart but always held space for it. They moved inside, and Abigail sank into the sofa. Ethan sat across from her, leaning forward, listening as she recounted everything: the funeral, the divorce, Kioma, the humiliation that still clung to her skin like frost. Ethan didn't interrupt. His jaw tightened at moments. His eyes darkened with anger she knew wasn't for her but for the pain she had been forced to endure. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "Abigail," he said softly, "I haven't forgotten you. Not once. I wanted to reach out every year, but you seemed happy. Or at least I hoped you were. I didn't want to interfere." Her throat thickened. "I thought you moved on." "I tried," he admitted, giving a faint, sad smile. "But some people don't leave you, even when life takes you different directions." A sharp contraction hit her then, forcing her forward with a cry. Ethan sprang to her side, supporting her with both hands. Fear flickered across his eyes, but his actions were steady. "You need a doctor," he urged. "It's too early," she protested through shallow breaths. "They said I might feel this for days." "I don't care what they said," he replied. "You're not going through this alone." She let him guide her to the couch, his hand never leaving her back. His instincts were gentle but confident, nothing like Aaron's neglectful detachment. In just a few minutes, Ethan showed more care than Aaron had offered in months. When she regained her breath, she told him about the inheritance, how her mother had left her a fortune she never knew existed. Ethan didn't react with shock or greed. Instead, his expression softened with admiration. "She wanted you to be protected," he said. She saw further ahead than anyone else. He offered to help her analyze and secure the portfolios, not because he wanted a share, not because he wanted power, but because he wanted her to feel safe. As the evening light drifted into the room, illuminating the tension lines on her face, Ethan looked at her with a quiet reverence. Her pain didn't make her smaller in his eyes, it made her braver. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost everything. Then you showed up." He shook his head gently. "You gave me the chance to be here. I've been waiting for that for a long time. Hope blows." Later, he told her the story she had never been ready to hear, how he planned to confess his feelings their senior year, how his father's sudden illness sent him abroad before he got the chance, and how he returned to find her married. He hadn't wanted to disturb the life she seemed to be building. "I always hoped you were happy," he said quietly. "If I'd known." She touched his hand, stopping him. "The past is done. We can only move forward." His gaze deepened, protective and fierce. "Then hear this, Abigail. Whoever hurt you will face the consequences of their choices. I won't let them break you again." A warmth spread through her chest, easing the fractures of her heart. She felt something shift, something that resembled hope stretching its limbs after a long sleep. Ethan rose and rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said, voice steady as sunset light poured through the window. For the first time since her world shattered, Abigail looked up and believed him. And as the last traces of daylight wrapped around them, she realized something else too. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her rise. A soft drizzle tapped against the windows that night, a steady whisper that matched the quiet uncertainty inside Abigail's apartment. She had just finished folding a small blanket for the baby when a sudden, wrenching pain tore across her abdomen. This one was different, deeper, sharper, unmistakably urgent. The blanket slipped from her fingers as she gripped the edge of the table, her breath catching in her throat. Panic surged through her as another wave hit, harder than the last. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, dialing the one person she knew would come. "Ethan," Her voice cracked the moment he answered. Something's wrong. He didn't ask for details. He didn't hesitate. She heard only the scrape of a chair, muffled voices from a meeting he abandoned mid-sentence, and then his steady, determined reply. I'm on my way. Hold on, Abigail. I'm coming. Minutes later, he burst through her door, his hair damp from the rain, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The moment he saw her doubled over with pain, he swept her into his arms without another word. Rain soaked into his shirt as he carried her to the car, ignoring the water pooling on the pavement, ignoring everything but her. At the hospital entrance, he shouted for assistance, his voice ringing with a fear he didn't have time to hide. Nurses rushed forward with a wheelchair, guiding them toward labor and delivery. As she was rolled through the bright hallways, Abigail struggled to stay focused, breathing through each contraction. Ethan stayed beside her, wiping sweat from her brow, whispering steady assurances that grounded her even when she felt she might shatter. Every sound in the delivery room seemed amplified, the rhythmic beeping of the fetal monitor, the metallic clinks of instruments, the distant footsteps outside the door. The overhead lights were sterile and unforgiving, but within their glow, something powerful was taking shape. This wasn't just a birth, it was a rebirth. When the contractions intensified, her mind tore back to the graveyard, to Aaron's cold voice, the humiliation, the abandonment. The pain of that day pulsed through her like a bruise on her soul, but she clung to her mother's final promise. My child, she whispered through clenched teeth, I won't let anyone hurt you the way they hurt me. Her resolve solidified with each breath. This child would never know the cruelty she had endured. This child was her beginning, not her end. Then, through the blistering pain, the room shifted. A single, piercing newborn cry filled the air. Abigail sobbed at the same moment, overwhelmed as her son announced himself to the world. Time seemed to slow as the doctor lifted the tiny, wailing body, and the nurse turned not toward her at first, but toward Ethan. He froze, his expression cracking wide open with awe. He reached out, barely daring to breathe as he held the infant, his hands trembling around the fragile life curled against his chest. Hi, Simon, he whispered, his voice thick. You did so well. It was a moment Abigail could never have imagined, a man who wasn't the father being the first to hold her child. Yet somehow it felt right. It felt safe. Ethan looked at Simon as though he had been waiting for him his entire life. When the nurse finally handed the baby to Abigail, she felt a warmth fill her arms so completely she thought she might burst. She pressed Simon close, inhaling his soft scent, and for the first time since her mother's funeral, she felt whole. Later, in the recovery room, the storm passed outside, leaving behind a muted calm. Abigail cradled Simon while Ethan stood beside the bed, his eyes moving between mother and child with a tenderness that softened every sharp edge of the world. She reached for his hand without thinking. Thank you, she murmured. If you hadn't been here, I don't know what I would have done. Ethan shook his head lightly. You don't owe me anything. Being here, this is what I wanted, what I'll always want. When the nurses brought paperwork for insurance and hospital billing, Ethan signed what needed signing before she could object, quietly handling the fees. She protested weakly, but he cut her off with a gentle firmness. This isn't charity. It's care. Let me take some weight off your shoulders. Meanwhile, Abigail's story, tragic, heartbreaking, and now unexpectedly inspiring, began circulating online. Photos from the funeral had already gone viral, and whispers spread quickly. The woman whose husband left her in front of her mother's grave had given birth alone, brave and unbroken. Articles framed her as a symbol of resilience. None of them knew about the fortune her mother left behind. None of them knew she was on the verge of becoming someone far more powerful than the woman Aaron believed he crushed. That night, holding Simon while watching Ethan adjust the hospital blanket around her feet, Abigail felt a shift inside her. She stood at a crossroads. She could continue living in the shadow of betrayal, the role of the woman abandoned, or she could step into the legacy her mother prepared for her, a legacy of strength, vision, and independence. She looked down at her son, his tiny fingers clutching her own. This life, she whispered to him, will be built on truth, on love, never on lies. Ethan met her gaze and nodded as if he understood every word. As she closed her eyes, she made herself a promise, one that echoed louder than the storm had hours before. Her mother had given her the strength to survive. Now it was time to rise. The morning sunlight filtered softly into the apartment when Abigail returned home with Simon nestled against her chest. Somehow, the place felt different now. Maybe it was because Ethan had spent the past 2 days quietly cleaning, organizing, and preparing for her return. Or maybe it was because Abigail herself had changed. The shadows in her heart were still present, but they no longer consumed her. She carried a new fire inside, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The apartment hummed with a calm she didn't expect. Simon slept peacefully in his bassinet while Ethan unpacked hospital supplies, moving with a natural ease that made Abigail's chest warm. For a moment, she watched him in silence, struck by how seamlessly he had slipped into her life. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Barrett Roberts entered with his briefcase, offering a polite nod. "Abigail," he greeted, "congratulations, and welcome to the beginning." He laid out his materials at the dining table and opened a thick binder. Abigail sat down, Ethan beside her, listening attentively. Barrett tapped one page with his pen. "Your mother didn't just leave you wealth. She left you a structure, a system built to protect you from exploitation, especially from your former husband's family." Quote, he walked her through the assets, commercial properties across multiple states, tech investments that had multiplied in value, international holdings, and the cornerstone of it all, the Margaret Gates Foundation, a charitable organization her mother quietly built in her name. The magnitude of it left Abigail breathless. Her mother hadn't been preparing for disaster. She had been preparing for Abigail's rise. Barrett explained how the trust shielded her from Aaron entirely. Not only could he not touch her fortune, but the divorce proceedings couldn't even reference it as marital property. Abigail's prenuptial agreement, once something Aaron's mother had forced upon her, had turned into her greatest protection. Abigail spent hours absorbing every detail Barrett offered. She stumbled at first, financial terms drowned her. Charts blurred together, but each time she hesitated, Ethan stepped in gently, explaining the concepts in simpler terms without ever making her feel small. She found herself straightening her posture, scribbling notes, asking sharper questions. Confidence didn't arrive instantly, but it grew with each passing minute. By the end of the day, Barrett leaned back, assessing her with approval. "You're learning quickly. Margaret would be proud." Abigail felt her throat tighten. She hoped so. She wanted to honor her mother, not by hiding, but by becoming the woman her mother believed she could be. As days passed, everything about Abigail began to shift. She dressed not to disappear but to show up. Her voice grew steadier. When she held meetings with Barrett, she no longer glanced at Ethan for reassurance every time she spoke. She was discovering her strength, reclaiming pieces of herself Aaron had chipped away. When Barrett suggested she attend a small charity gala to reshape her public image, Abigail hesitated only for a moment. Ethan placed a hand on her back. "Let people see who you really are," he said. His confidence in her lit something inside she didn't know she needed. Meanwhile, whispers of Aaron's troubles began filtering through the business world. A former colleague messaged Abigail. Rumors of tax inconsistencies, unusual transactions, and questionable bidding practices. She glanced at the message but didn't reply. She didn't celebrate, didn't rage. She simply felt detached. Life was balancing itself without her involvement. Her focus stayed on Simon, on her growing understanding of the empire Margaret had built, and on the quiet support Ethan offered every day. He cooked for her. He held Simon so she could rest. He walked her through dense financial documents with infinite patience, and when she caught him looking at her softly, reverently, she felt something warm bloom in her chest. One evening, after reviewing investment strategies, Abigail stood before the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were clearer, her posture straighter. There was purpose in her expression, not pain. She was no longer the broken figure at the cemetery. She was a mother, a leader, a woman rising, and as she whispered to her reflection, the words carried the weight of a coming storm. "If Aaron thinks he buried me, he's about to learn just how wrong he was." Abigail stood before the mirror, adjusting the soft drape of the simple yet elegant dress she had chosen for the evening. It wasn't extravagant, but it carried a quiet strength, a confidence she had slowly begun reclaiming piece by piece. The woman looking back at her no longer resembled the shattered figure at the cemetery. Her eyes were clearer, steadier. She still carried scars, but they no longer controlled her. Behind her, Ethan approached with Simon nestled in his arms, the baby sleeping peacefully against his chest. "You're going to do great," he said, smiling in a way that warmed the space around them. Abigail nodded, exhaling softly. Tonight marked her first appearance since the scandal. She wasn't returning to defend herself. She was returning to redefine herself. The charity gala was being held at the city's medical foundation, a polished venue with glass walls that reflected the warm glow of evening lights. When Abigail stepped out of the car, the shift in the crowd was immediate. Conversations paused, cameras lifted, heads turned. Her name traveled through murmurs like a spark catching dry leaves. "Isn't that the woman whose husband left her at her mother's funeral? She looks incredible, completely different," taunted she. Abigail held her head high, walking with measured grace, her lips curved in a polite smile. She didn't shrink beneath the attention. She allowed it, owned it. She embodied a quiet rebirth that silenced whispers even before they fully formed. As she moved through the crowd, Ethan remained close but respectfully in the background, giving her space to take center stage. Midway through the gala, one of the organizers approached her with a warm but tentative expression. "Miss Gomez, would you be willing to say a few words about your thoughts on supporting expecting mothers?" The room seemed to pause. Abigail felt her pulse quicken, but then she glanced at Ethan. He gave a slight nod, steady, encouraging. She inhaled deeply and walked toward the stage. Facing the audience, she felt her hands tremble slightly, but her voice, when she spoke, was unwavering. "Many of us don't realize how fragile life is," she began. "How quickly it can change. I lost my mother recently, at a moment I needed her most. And in that same moment, I faced another painful loss. But what I learned, what I'm still learning, is that women carry a strength we're often not credited for. We endure. We rise. Not because life is kind, but because we choose not to let it break us." She didn't mention Aaron, yet the entire room understood the weight behind her words. Silence settled thickly, before applause erupted, genuine, resonant, rising in waves. For the first time in a long time, Abigail felt seen not as a victim, but as a woman who had fought her way out of the dark. Reporters flocked toward her afterward, not with invasive questions, but with admiration. Articles began appearing almost instantly. From heartbreak to hope, Abigail Gomez inspires thousands. Her image transformed in a matter of hours, from the humiliated wife to a figure of empowerment. When the event ended, Abigail and Ethan walked outside together, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. Streetlights glowed softly as they strolled down the quiet sidewalk. Simon slept in his stroller, oblivious to the world shifting around his mother. "You were incredible up there," Ethan said. "You proved that pain can't destroy someone unless they surrender to it." Abigail slowed her steps, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "I wasn't sure I could do it," she admitted, "but it felt right." "It felt right because it was you," he said, strong, honest, unbreakable. The warmth in his words lingered in her chest long after they returned home. The next morning, Barrett forwarded an article about Aaron's company. A routine audit had flagged inconsistencies, potential bid manipulation, misallocated funds. Abigail read it without emotion, then set her phone down. She was done allowing Aaron's choices to dictate her day. Later, as Ethan fed Simon in the living room, he glanced toward Abigail and felt something shift inside him. She moved with purpose now. Her laughter came easier. Her presence filled the room differently, brighter, stronger. The woman he had fallen for years ago was resurfacing, but refined by everything she had survived. He found himself watching her not with longing, but with respect deep enough to quiet any doubt. By the end of the week, invitations poured in from other organizations. People wanted to hear her story. They wanted her voice. And as she stood in her home reading each message, she realized her life was expanding into spaces she had once been too afraid to imagine. Barrett called that evening, his voice calm but carrying a hint of pride. "Abigail, you're ready for the next stage. Everything your mother set in motion, you're stepping into it beautifully." She looked down at Simon, curled against her chest, then at Ethan, smiling gently from across the room. Ready, she thought. For the first time, she truly was. And the world, it seemed, was finally ready for her as well. Aaron DiCaprio strutted into his office that morning with his usual air of arrogance, convinced the world still bowed to him. He loosened his tie, humming softly as he reached his desk until a bright red envelope bearing the seal of the Federal Financial Crimes Unit froze him mid-motion. His stomach dropped, He tore it open with trembling hands. A summons. An investigation. Immediate cooperation required. For the first time in years, his breath caught in panic. This wasn't a minor audit. It was a full-scale investigation into his practices he knew were far from clean. His confidence began to crack as he scanned the accusations. Inflated bids, off-the-record payments, suspicious transfers. His entire empire, built on manipulation and shortcuts, was finally catching up to him. He called Kioma instinctively, needing reassurance, someone to manipulate or lean on. Her phone rang unanswered. He called again. Nothing. He drove to their shared penthouse, only to find the door locked and the place dark. A neighbor poked his head out to explain she'd left in a hurry the night before, dragging several suitcases behind her. She said she wouldn't be back, the neighbor added. Didn't look pregnant either. The words hit him like a slap. He thought he had won when she smiled at Abigail's pain. He thought he had chosen a better future. Instead, he had been conned by someone even more ruthless than he was. Meanwhile, the news cycle exploded. Headlines across financial networks screamed his downfall. Millionaire Aaron DiCaprio under federal investigation. Girlfriend vanishes amid scandal. Assets connected to fraudulent deals, sources say. Paparazzi crowded outside his office building. Former partners refused to take his calls. His attorney warned him to stay quiet. For the first time in a long time, Aaron tasted fear, not the kind that pricked the skin, but the kind that hollowed a man from the inside. His parents held a press conference within days. Evelyn Winfrey, who once celebrated his cruelty toward Abigail, now stood stiffly at the podium, declaring, "Our family has no involvement in Aaron's business dealings. We will not comment further." Behind the scenes, Richard Trump had already withdrawn substantial investments from Aaron's companies, severing ties as cleanly as a blade. Abigail hadn't heard his voice since the funeral, but one afternoon her phone lit up with his name. She let it ring. Later, an email appeared short, panicked, asking if he could see his child, if she would speak to him, if she could help him somehow. She closed the message and continued feeding Simon his bottle. There was nothing left to say. When Ethan noticed her quiet expression, he asked gently, "Are you all right?" She nodded once. "He's just facing the consequences he chose." The investigation intensified over the following weeks. Agents froze his accounts. Several properties were seized. Former accomplices testified to save themselves, each confession tightening the net around him. Eventually, the official charges arrived: tax evasion, fraud, bid manipulation. Aaron had no ground left to stand on. Every news outlet contrasted his spiral with Abigail's ascent. While Aaron DiCaprio falls, Abigail Gomez rises as a symbol of strength. Two opposite destinies. Betrayal leads to ruin. Resilience leads to power. Each comparison cut deeper than the last, and Aaron found himself alone in a dim, half-empty apartment, the one Kioma had abandoned, the one Abigail once made a home in. He sat at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, as notification after notification chimed from his phone. Reporters, investigators, attorneys, creditors. His world was collapsing, and all he could do was watch it burn. "Abigail," he whispered into his palms, voice shaking. "If you hadn't signed that day, maybe," but the thought died as quickly as it formed. Nothing he could say would undo what he had done. He had destroyed everything with his own hands, and now, the wheel he once spun so confidently had finally turned back toward him. The courthouse steps overflowed with reporters that morning, their lenses pointed at the police cruiser pulling in beneath the federal building's awning. When the back door opened, Aaron DiCaprio stepped out in handcuffs, thinner than he'd ever been, the sharp arrogance he once wore now replaced with exhaustion. His eyes darted anxiously beneath the harsh flashes of cameras. It was a jarring contrast to the man who had once strutted through a cemetery, tossing divorce papers onto his grieving wife's hands, as though her heart were disposable. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Every seat was filled. The press whispered among themselves, waiting for the woman whose story had captured the nation. When Abigail entered, the room shifted as if realigning itself around her. Dressed in a white suit, tailored with quiet authority, she moved with unshaken confidence. Ethan walked beside her, tall and composed, and Barrett followed behind with his case files in hand. The cameras pivoted instantly, abandoning Aaron to focus on the woman he had tried to destroy but who, instead, had risen beyond even his most bitter nightmares. "She looks unstoppable," someone whispered, and she did. As Abigail took her seat, she felt Ethan's reassuring presence beside her. He didn't need to speak. His steady gaze said enough. She lifted her chin, no longer the woman crushed by betrayal, but one ready to witness justice written plainly before her. The prosecution began by projecting documents onto the screen: bank transfers, unexplained withdrawals, emails from Aaron to his team instructing them to manipulate bid numbers. With every new piece of evidence, Aaron's posture collapsed a little more. He couldn't hide behind charm now. Facts weighed heavier than his excuses. Kioma was nowhere to be found. She had vanished weeks before, leaving Aaron to take the fall alone. In the gallery, a ripple of tension ran through the audience as a former employee, a man Aaron once trusted deeply, took the stand. His voice trembled at first, but soon steadied as he described years of falsified ledgers and shady deals. He only cared about himself, the man said. Not the company, not the people working for him. Aaron did whatever benefited Aaron. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge paused her note-taking. Abigail stared at her hands, not because she doubted the truth, but because she needed the reminder that this moment was real. She felt no satisfaction watching Aaron crumble, only clarity. The man who had discarded her on the worst day of her life was not a force of power, only a fraud exposed by his own greed. At one point, Aaron dared to look at her. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. His were pleading, desperate, searching for the woman he once controlled. But Abigail's expression remained calm, detached. She felt no hate, no longing, just distance. When Ethan gently placed his hand over hers, she turned toward him, a quiet, steady gesture that told Aaron everything he didn't want to know. She had moved on, completely. During a recess, Aaron learned that both Evelyn Winfrey and Richard Trump had refused to sign his bail request. Their lawyer stated plainly, "The family does not wish to be associated with Aaron's misconduct." The news spread instantly, fueling headlines. Wealthy family abandons son facing federal charges. When court reconvened, the prosecution recommended a substantial prison sentence and massive financial penalties, citing the severity of his crimes and the breadth of his deception. Aaron's lawyer attempted a weak defense, but the evidence was insurmountable. By the time the judge delivered the verdict guilty on multiple counts, Aaron looked hollow, as though life itself were draining out of him. Officers approached to escort him from the room. As he passed Abigail, he whispered, voice cracking, "I'm sorry." She didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She only watched him with serene finality, speaking silently in her own heart. "You're no longer part of my story." Outside, cameras flashed wildly as Aaron was loaded into the van. Meanwhile, Ethan pulled Abigail close, offering her strength she no longer felt she lacked but still appreciated. "You stood taller today than anyone I've ever known," he murmured. For the first time in weeks, Abigail felt something bloom inside her relief. Justice had finally come full circle. The chapter of Aaron DiCaprio closed in a blaze of camera flashes and steel doors. And in that moment, Abigail stepped fully into the life waiting for her beyond the courthouse steps. When the courthouse finally faded behind them, the weight Abigail had carried for months seemed to lift all at once. She held Simon close, feeling his tiny breaths warm against her collarbone. Ethan walked ahead, clearing a path through the reporters, shielding her from lingering flashes. Once they reached his car and the doors clicked shut, the chaos gave way to silence. "We're done with that chapter," Ethan said softly as he started the engine. Abigail nodded. Outside, the world buzzed with headlines, but inside the car, peace settled like a soft blanket. She turned toward Simon, brushing her fingers over his cheek. His innocence grounded her. The storm had passed. Now came the rebuilding. Instead of driving her home, Ethan continued toward the highway. She looked at him, confused. "There's something I want to show you," he said. An hour later, they pulled up to a coastal property tucked behind dunes and wild seagrass. A gentle sunlight shimmered over the ocean, painting gold across the waves. The house stood modest but beautiful, its large windows facing the sea. Ethan hesitated before opening her door. "I bought this months ago," he admitted. "For you, for Simon, for whatever future you'd allow me to be part of." Inside, Abigail found rooms filled with warmth, soft colors, comfortable furniture, a nursery stocked with blankets and tiny clothes, all chosen with care. In a quiet corner of the living room stood a framed photograph of her mother, placed on a console with fresh lilies. The sight broke something open inside her. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "You remembered her," she whispered. I remember everything that matters to you, Ethan replied. They sat together in the living room as the ocean murmured through the open windows. Ethan took her hands, his voice tinged with emotion he'd held back for years. I've loved you since we were 19, he said, and I carried that love quietly, even when life took us down different paths. I only wish I could have been there sooner. Abigail's breath trembled as she looked at him. I used to think you were late, she said, but now, I think you came exactly when I needed you. He closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the tenderness in her voice. Later, they took a walk along the shoreline. Ethan held Simon, bouncing him gently as the tide lapped at their feet. Abigail watched them with a fullness in her chest she hadn't known she was capable of. For the first time, she saw not a broken past but a horizon wide with possibility. The sun dipped low, staining the sky in shades of amber and rose. Abigail looked back on everything, the cruelty, the betrayal, the grief, the strength she'd scraped together day after day. She realized she no longer carried bitterness, only gratitude for the woman she had become. Ethan turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'm not Aaron, he said quietly. I won't disappear. I won't make you stand alone. I'll be here for you and for Simon, in every season. His voice was steady, a calm promise grounded in truth. Abigail stepped toward him, her heart finally unafraid. She leaned in, touching her lips to his in a gentle, lingering kiss. It wasn't passionate or rushed, it was healing, an oath woven from the pieces of two lives finally aligning. Simon let out a soft giggle, breaking the intensity and making them both laugh, their foreheads pressed together. That night, after settling Simon in his crib, Abigail stepped onto the balcony. The sea shimmered under the moonlight, endless and reassuring. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her gently against his chest. The warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet house they now shared, all of it felt like a promise fulfilled. Thank you, Mom, she murmured into the wind. You led me here. She pressed a hand over Ethan's, smiling with a peace she had never known. Not every person who enters our life is meant to stay, but those who remain, those who choose us when the storms rage, become our true home. And in that home, illuminated by moonlight and love, Abigail finally found her beginning. Life has a way of knocking us down without warning, yet it also gives us the strength to rise in ways we never imagined. The hardest moments can shape us into someone braver, softer, and wiser than before. Healing isn't a grand victory, it's the quiet realization that you kept going, even when everything in you wanted to stop. And that persistence becomes the part of you no one can take away. If you're listening to this right now, maybe during a calm evening, maybe on your morning commute, share with me in the comments what feeling this story leaves you with. Or simply tell me what the weather is like, where you are, and how it matches your mood. And if stories like this help you feel seen or understood, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and stay a while. There are many more journeys ahead, and I'd love for you to walk them with us.